What family secret was finally spilled in your family? That my parents had to get married. They always told us they got married in 1961, but it was 1962, 3 months before my sister was born. What's amusing is that my father was an accountant who was insanely fast with math. Whenever he was asked how many years they'd been married, he'd be off by 1. My mother would correct him through clenched teeth and then my father would nod and agree. I was always told by an older relative of mine that the first child in a marriage for some reason always took less than 9 months. I always found it amusing to think about that. My great-grandmother wasn't actually Mexican but rather was adopted by a Mexican family from a Chinese family who was being kicked out of Mexico when railroad construction was over. She always had more typically Asian features but only spoke Spanish and it was never really questioned. 23andMe is a heck of a thing. When my paternal grandfather died, the federal gov reached out to do a state funeral. He'd been career army and a colonel, so we didn't question it. Then the funeral came and they went all out. Huge procession, people showing up who are really big names, like heads of debts, senators, retired senators, people from the CIA and state debt. It was nuts and we were all super confused. Turns out he was a key dude in the OC during World War II, and when the OC splintered into the CIA and Secret Service, he went the Secret Service route. He wasn't on White House detail, but instead worked in a covert office that dealt with counterfeiting and currency. He went blind when I was a toddler and retired from the army for whatever reason. He told no one about all his covert work with the OC and Secret Service, and the only person who knew, my grandmother, was sworn to secrecy and never told anyone. My father grew up thinking he was just a colonel working on base. Only after his death were we given all sorts of cool crap like publications by him, lectures given by him, and all kinds of things from various things he did and was known for. All I knew him as was a blind old man who was perpetually smoking, drinking and being a crotchety bastard. Turns out he was a bad mother and all, but none of us knew. In the 1970s, a dead girl was found on my grandpa's property. Everyone, including the local police, just assumed she was in with a bad crowd and murdered by drug dealers. In the 90s, some of his grandkids came forward about all the molestation. After that, people started to realize grandpa probably killed that girl. My grandparents are first cousins. An uncle on the same side of the family is in prison for the assassination of a presidential candidate. Family still says he was framed and is innocent. I see a lot of stories about people finding out that who they thought was their parents weren't the people raising them, and this one is a little bit different. My dad always thought his father who raised him wasn't his biodad, and the father thought the same. He was treated terribly by his father because the father was told he couldn't have children, and my father was born prematurely, but at a healthy weight. So, everyone assumed my grandmother had an affair and got pregnant with my dad. It was to the point that after my grandmother died, my grandfather failed to even mention to his new wife that he had a son and grandchild, me. Years later, my dad gets an ancestry DNA test for him and me. He find out that his dad was actually his biodad. It was shocking and sad. Found out my grandma had a baby as a teenager and was forced to give him up for adoption by my great-grandparents. 40 years later he found us. Same thing happened to my mom. I'm 33 now. Older half-brother is roughly 35. I hold hope that I'll meet him one day. My cousin is actually my sister. Apparently my mom got pregnant really young and her much older sister adopted my sister and raised her as her own. It was actually an amazing moment when we found out. My cousin, sister, and the sister I was raised with and I are really close. Just happened last year. We're all old now. I'm 50 and my cousin sister is 58. So it's just a really neat thing that makes us all happy. My de facto uncle. He and my aunt never married but have been together since well before I was born, with a few hiccups. Has a child with another woman. It became common knowledge when the girl was 6 and was starting to understand the situation. At first it was a bit scandalous, but she's been welcomed with open arms by my entire family, including her half-siblings' maternal grandparents. She's treated the same as all the other kids her age. Her half-sister, my cousin, has a daughter the same age and they're best friends. Go to the same high school. Totally inseparable. Technically aunt and niece, haha. She comes to all our family events and she's an awesome kid. We're all stoked to have her in our family. After my mom died, I found out the real story behind my parents' marriage. She came to my father's country to visit some of her relatives. Met my father, and after just 1 week she asked him to marry her so she could stay in the country. My father accepted because he had no one else and his parents were pressing him to get married already. But the highlight of the story is that over some time, the two of them fell in love with each other. Their love only grew over the time and they were really happy together. My mother spent her last days very ill, and she would accept only my father by her bedside. He swears to this day that she was an angel sent from God to take care of him. I am shocked that they got married just like that, out of the blue, and ended up loving each other so deeply. I can only hope to have as good and loving marriage as they had. You made it worth scrolling through all these depressing stories. Thanks for sharing. My uncles are infamous criminals who killed multiple people. I thought they bred dogs. They may have also bred dogs. We found out after my grandfather died that none of his 7 children with my grandmother were his, and that they all likely had different fathers. About a month ago, my mother-in-law's 88-year-old sister revealed on her deathbed that her husband's best friend was actually the father of all 4 of her children. Her husband was an abusive grade A jerk by all accounts. While everyone was shocked, no one was saddened by this news. My uncle served in Vietnam. While over there, his troop found a baby that had been orphaned or abandoned. They aren't sure. My uncle was shipping back to Australia soon and wanted to adopt him, but my aunt said no. They'd only been married about 4 months when he was drafted, so while I don't agree with my aunt's actions and generally don't like her as a person, I can understand why she said no. My uncle's troop found a family to raise the baby, and that's the story the whole family knows. The secret is that my uncle and some other guys from his troop stayed in contact with the family and the kid, sending them money every month to help raise him and then to help him go to university, and eventually helped him and his adoptive family move to Australia in the last 90s. My aunt and the rest of my family had no idea all this time. It only came out when my aunt and uncle divorced in 2017 and she had a forensic accountant go through their bank records. She worked at a bank for like 40 years and always noticed the money missing, but his reasons were always justified. Since we all know now, my uncle has introduced some of us to the guy and his family. They're all really lovely people. I was that baby. Nanny I had when I was younger was actually my dad's attempted sister wife. She found out how batshit he was and dipped. My great grandfather didn't die of cancer. He died from complications after being shot when one of his businesses was being robbed. Maybe. He also spent a lot of time in Atlantic City. He also had a lot of partners in the Teamsters and other unions in coal country. Also, everyone called him Smiling Tony, but his name wasn't Tony. He died in the 60s, long before my time. But when my great grandmother died 20 years ago, a very old guy showed up to the funeral in a white suit and all of the oldest people in my family kisses his hand. When I asked, no one knew who he was. My grandfather moved his family away from central PA in the late 60s and disconnected from all of this, but there it is. When I was 5 years old, 1988, Santa Claus left a Nintendo on our front porch. It was wrapped in newspaper, and my parents had no idea who gifted it to us. My dad, particularly, tried to figure it out. He was always suspicious that it had been a family friend. It was by far the best gift of the year, and we played it all the time throughout our childhood. My dad died in 2004. Last Christmas, my mom explained that she was the one who had bought it and surreptitiously placed it on the porch. My dad really liked to be in control of things and had forbidden the purchase. She knew better. She didn't tell a soul for 30 years. Thanks, Mom. I was 35 when my mother finally admitted to me that she'd been lying about who my birth father was. She waited until after I'd reached out to his other children and we all thought we were siblings. He later confirmed I wasn't his. She refused to tell me who my biological father really was. We went to my grandmother's for Christmas dinner like we did every year, and my uncle drank too much and kind of hinted that he had an affair with my mother. A couple of months and 2 DNA tests later we found out my sister is actually his daughter. My dad never spoke to his brother again. And of course, my parents got divorced, and I needed a lot of therapy and chocolate. Gosh, we are trash. You're obviously not trash, but I do think you win this thread. That's one heck of a Christmas dinner. My mom and older brother are not biologically related to me. My bio mom died sometime after I was born, leaving me, my sister, and my dad behind. My brother was the one that told me. My parents never told me because they wanted to protect me from the truth. But my brother thought that was a BS reason for me to not know. I don't know if my parents know that I know the truth, but I don't want to bring it up either. After I was molested by my uncle, it came out he had done this to another one of my sisters and my family covered it up, particularly my mother. Now I know why my sister didn't like how close my uncle got to me when I was younger. It's never just one victim, which is why it's especially terrible to cover it up. Great-grandparents' 60th anniversary party at hotel ballroom with cousins, second cousins who hadn't seen each other in years. My mom and I were talking to my grandfather. Mom, wow, I haven't seen Chuck, Fred, and Claire in years. Me, no kidding. When do you think we'll get a group this big back together? Mom, Gramps' day is in 6 months. We'll see some people then. Me, 6 months? Isn't it his 60th? Or, Gramps, huh, I never thought about that. My grandfather was 60 when he realized his parents had a shotgun wedding. I had a similar experience at my grandparents' 50th anniversary, because it was precisely 7 months before my dad's 50th birthday. When my sister was diagnosed with cancer and her survival chances were low, it inevitably came out that she wasn't my sister. Parents must have felt we should all know the truth just in case. She survived her treatment, and will always be my sister. The scars on her elder family member's wrist were not from a botched suicide. They were from her mom trying to protect herself and her kids from the approaching Red Army. That was at the end of WW2 in Germany. This made it so much worse. After reading this thread, I would have probably done the same. My grandmother recently died. She was famous in our town for her amazing cooking catering, in particular her turkey dinners. Notably, her gravy was absolutely amazing. So delicious. She had a heart attack several years ago and her near-death experience convinced her to share some of her secret recipes with me. All except for her gravy recipe. When she died this spring, I was going through her pantry and found an entire bucket of KFC gravy mix. She was literally using KFC gravy mix as a base to make her incredible gravy. Huge scandal. Mayo. Faking gravy has got to be the most charming family secret out of all the horrible crap in this thread. Due to 23andMe, my dad learned that his recently deceased father was not his biological father. It wasn't a situation related to my grandma cheating either, it was a sperm donation. So, they knew this was the case his entire life. Pretty crazy they never told him. His parents did not pass until he was 65 years old. Talk about a curveball. Sperm donation was very secretive in the past, sometimes even a secret from the respective dad. BC there was such stigma around male infertility. I only just recently heard about this, but my grandmother had gotten a little drunk with my dad and brother a month or so ago and started talking about our great uncle Ferber. Not sure on the spelling, but from what I heard he apparently killed quite a few people and buried them on some family owned land in a swamp. My dad fathered a child in high school. His side of the family knew, and my mom. We found out years after he died that we have a half sister. A buddy of mine met a girl at a bar. They totally hit it off. He told his parents about her and his dad took him outside and told him not to date her because she was his half sister. My mom cheating on my dad with my now stepfather. My parents divorced when I was really young, about 1 year old. So I don't remember anything about that. When I would ask as a curious kid why they split up, both said that they just fell out of love. I already had a feeling that this was not true because through my grandma I knew the divorce was in 1996. But my mom and stepfather started dating in 1995. On my 18th birthday my stepfather confessed to me in private that they had an affair all that time ago and he still feels awful because he feels like he broke up that family. I told him that all is fine because everyone is happy now and I already kinda knew it. Some years later my stepmother told me that my mom actually kicked out my dad without telling him why. She just needed a break. Remember, she just had a newborn and my dad could barely see me at the beginning. My dad later found out through the landlord that my stepfather had moved in the house my dad rented with his wife where his newborn daughter was living with a stranger. To this day I don't know how my dad managed to overcome this without starting a huge fight. I never talked with my parents about it. Just once when my mom was having a rant about a neighbor who left her husband for another man. I told her to stop throwing rocks while sitting in a glass house. I hope you know what this saying means. She definitely does. Your mom is hypocritical as heck. Your dad managed in spite of what your mom did. That takes some mental fortitude. This is years ago, and I only got a few rough details, but my baby mama's dad wound up getting caught in a sting trying to purchase a teenage girl. He had a separate apartment all set up, transferred the funds, and when he went to the delivery meet, was arrested by the feds. After my grandfather passed, we found out he had fathered a child when he was posted in Italy during World War II. He never knew. His mother intercepted any letters from the Italian girl. He came home, met and married my grandmother and had 4 children. I forget who in the family found out and how. It's crazy to think we have a whole Italian family out there. Imagine that Italian girl sending letters and believing someday a reply will come. Thinking about it makes me sad. My grandma didn't drive. I thought she couldn't, but it was just never discussed. One day when I was maybe 7-8, I'd been trying to get anyone to drive me to the store for candy. We were visiting my aunt and uncle. Grandma lived with them. They had Bitto honey at the local store, which I could no longer get at home, but no one would take me to the store. Finally I said I'd just ask grandma, and my cousin chimes in with, "Grandma can't drive." "Oh, you bet your sweet butt I can drive. They just don't let me." Grandma had overheard and she was in high dudgeon. But that's all that was said about it, and my aunt finally took me to the store, so I forgot about it. Years later, when I'd just gotten my license, I asked my mom what was up with grandma not driving. She explained that during Prohibition grandma bootlegged alcohol for moonshiners. She was very successful at it. She was so successful at it that when the moonshiners were finally busted, even though the revenuers never caught my grandma, her license was suspended by the state to never be reissued. Later in life she was told she could petition for it back, but it came with an admission of guilt or some such. She told them to go to heck. I love this story so much. Your grandma was an old Timmy badass. I knew an old man who, when he was a little kid, watched the bootleggers speed through their town as it was supposedly quite the exciting event for their small farming community. Little kids were probably watching your grandma race down the roads of their towns back in the day, too. My mother often had stories like, "At your age, we got up at 4 AM to work on the farm. After the job, we went home to have lunch with your grandfather, then we walked 10 kilometers to go to school, and when we were back, we used to work in the field in a tractor until it was 6 PM to go and cook dinner for your grandfather." And me like, "Yeah, but he didn't work the farm with you in the morning," and she was changing the subject. I learned in Easter that my grandfather was alcoholic, got drunk every night, didn't get up in the morning to go to work, or was in fake jobs to lie to the family and go to drink, while the children had to go in elementary school and manage a farm. Then he was in prison because he touched the neighbor's children. When he got out of prison, he took out a loan of $30,000 in my grandmother's name and ran away with the money. Then he died a few years later. My grandmother bought herself an used Ford Limited, and no one cried at the funeral. 30 years later, I learned who my grandfather was. That my grandfather was an atomic soldier. Instead of sending him to fight in the Korean War, they sent him to Nevada, where, after having him turn away from the initial flash, he witnessed the mushroom cloud. After that was over, he was ordered to march to the detonation point, where he was unwittingly exposed to high amounts of radiation. Luckily for my family, my grandpa is now in his 90s, even after a few cancer scares, and the rest of us, my mom, aunt, cousins, sister, and I are cancer-free and fairly healthy, but this is medical information that we really should have known earlier. My sister cheated on her husband throughout her entire marriage to the point that all 3 of her kids have different biological fathers. That's close to mine. Sister cheated on hers for 10 years. The guy she finally left her husband for was a PA involved with theft, sale of prescription meds, and ended up being the killer in a murder-suicide 2 years later with his co-conspirator. My aunt wasn't my grandfather's child. He met my granny when my aunt was a very sick infant. She had polio and wasn't expected to survive. My granddad married my granny so she could get on his insurance and move to an area that had proper medical support. My aunt was the first infant to survive open heart surgery at Yale New Haven Hospital, and although she had to be in leg braces most of her childhood, she had a great, although not long enough, life. My granddad loved her like she was his own, and I never knew until she went to her bio dad's funeral when I was a teenager. That's honestly a really nice story. As a young teenager, my grandma shot her pedophile father in the back while he was sleeping. He had been molesting her and all her siblings. She ran away after being hidden by her brother for some time. Her father survived though. Thankfully my grandma never faced any legal consequences, but she was bat crap crazy until the day she died. My aunt told me at her funeral because I asked why grandma was the way she was. That's heartbreaking she had to go through that. My mother had a child when she was a teenager, and she had given him up for adoption to a family. After this, she went to college, got a degree, married my father, and gave birth to my 4 siblings and myself. 30 years after giving her child up for adoption, I remember her getting a phone call and immediately locking herself in her room. I was about 12 at the time. I remember feeling scared because I could hear my mom crying, but she didn't want to see anybody or talk about why she was crying. On an evening later that week, my parents sat each of us kids down and told us about my mom's past and explained that my half-brother had reached out to my mom wanting to meet her and get to know her. My dad had known ever since he and mom were dating in college, and I believe my oldest sister had been told previous to this point. But the rest of my siblings and myself and all of the in-laws on my dad's side, my grandma, aunts, and uncles etc., didn't know about this part of her past. We are fairly religious conservative, so it was really shocking at first. My mom then flew out to the state where my half-brother lived with her sisters and met him. Both my mom and my half-brother were both very nervous about the whole thing, but by the end of their trip meeting each other, they got to rebuild a relationship. After a bit of time, we, my siblings and I, got to meet him too. Fast forwarding to now, he's since moved to our same state and we see him much more frequently. He's in all of our family pictures. We see him occasionally for holidays and birthdays, and we all see him as part of our family. We're a very close-knit and extroverted family, while he is much shyer, so at times he can be a bit more distant than we would like, but we give him his space. I know my mom stays in close touch with him, and we love it when he's able to make it for family dinners and whatnot. Back then, I was the youngest and, up till then, the only boy in my family, so I loved learning that I had an older brother. Now that I'm an adult, I sometimes get his old clothes because we're roughly the same size. He's got good taste too, so I really lucked out, haha. I love that this family secret was spilled and that we were able to welcome my brother into our family and have him in our lives. One of the few wholesome ones here for sure. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.